just to give a quick overview, what I thought we would do is, I thought I would talk for a while, probably not more than 15 or 20 minutes, and then I thought I'd put each of you on the spot briefly, and then I thought we would all talk to each other. And if for some reason we run aground, which doesn't seem possible, then I'll make you write in your notebooks or something. I'll put you to a task, but I don't anticipate that happening. So I spent most of yesterday cogitating about this subject. What did we call it exactly? The role of place in creativity and storytelling. I spent most of yesterday thinking about this and thinking about the conversation that we'd have today and thinking through the subject from different angles so that I'd sound really intelligent when I came in and talked to you. And by the end of the day, I felt pretty well satisfied with my thoughts, and I thought I really articulated some stuff here. And my 9-year-old came home from school. He's a 4th grader. And I was done with work, ready to serve as parent, and he sat down with his homework, and within just a few minutes, I heard that horrible noise that you never want to hear as a parent. And I said, oh, what's wrong? And it turned out he had an assignment, and he read it to me. His assignment was to write about why the setting of the given book that he was reading was important. And I said, lucky you. I said, Mommy is an expert on this subject, so just let me help you. And so we sat down and looked at his book. And his book was a book for 8 to 12-year-olds about a kid between the ages of 8 and 12. I'm not sure her exact age. And she went to school, and she lived with her family, and she shopped at the mall. And, by the end of 20 minutes of really, really difficult conversation with my angry, frustrated 9-year-old, I couldn't help him at all. I had nothing to offer. It was really humbling. And so I come to you in a spirit of total humility, because my 9-year-old ended up writing an essay with sentences like, the setting in Millicent Min, Girl Genius, is important because without the setting, you wouldn't know Millicent lived in a house. So, shaken by this failure last night, I was trying to think about how it is that place does matter in writing and in the writing process. Because when I was asked to do this, the first thing I thought of was place. I thought, I want to talk about place and how it affects my work, and I want to talk about it with other people and learn how it affects their work. So, setting aside my failure with my 9-year-old for a minute, which I'm tempted to chalk up to the book itself, which I realize is cheating, I thought I'd tell a brief story about place in its relationship to my work, and then, move from there to a broader discussion. So a number of years ago, more than a decade ago now, I was trying to start work on a book. It was my 2nd book, and I thought I had everything that I needed to start this book. I actually thought I was unusually well prepared by comparison with the process of writing my first book, which had been very haphazard. For this 2nd book, I had a character who I thought was really fascinating. I had a situation that I thought was really unique, and I even had a plot, which is very, as it turns out, unusual for me, because in the rest of the history of my career to this point, I've never started a book with a plot before. That was the first and last time. I'd been doing research for over a year. I'd entered into what I call the decadent phase of research, when I was reading primary materials that really had nothing to do with my topic, because I couldn't get started. And it was in the middle of this struggle. Everything I attempted in terms of starting this book fell flat. Just nothing worked. And I couldn't figure out why. There was just this sense of terrible arbitrariness to the whole process. It felt like I could write anything and then nothing mattered. Despite having all these really specific things, a character and a plot, a compelling situation. And in the middle of this period of despair and confusion, I went on a camping and hiking trip with my then boyfriend, who's now my husband, and it rained every day. And it was gray and it was cold. And our trip was completely ruined by this. And one morning, sitting in a diner, in a town called Rhinebeck, New York, which some of you might know, up the Hudson, trying to figure out how to salvage the disaster of our trip, I noticed a little flyer by the door. And it was, not even a flyer, it was a strip of paper. It wasn't even a trifold, and it wasn't shiny. It was very low budget, and it was advertising a house tour. And I said, well, why don't we go on the house tour? Because we'll be indoors. So we went on this house tour. We found our way to this place at the back of a long, pothole-filled, unpaved driveway that had begun, between two crumbling stone posts in a crumbling stone wall on a long country road in somewhere out back of or behind of Rhinebeck entirely, outside of town. And we got to the end of this driveway, and there was this house that was this relic from the Gilded Age of New York, the age of the Titans. It was this enormous, completely decrepit mansion. It was so beautiful, and it was so clearly on its way to rack and ruin, with very, very little arresting that process, except for clearly these house tours that were, this desperate effort to somehow turn things around for this decaying house. And the house tours were very, very, at that time, it was very, very DIY. They were taking, your dollar bills in a little tin box. There's an old lady from the Historical Society sitting there. She'd put you in a folding chair, and then they put in this VHS cassette that told you a little bit about the history of the house. And you could see that someone was trying to, repaint over here, and someone was trying to wallpaper over there, and somebody was trying to glue the bricks to the walls again. And it was a really touching situation because of the shoestring quality of this renovation that was being attempted, but it was also really magnificent. It was so otherworldly. This place was astonishingly beautiful, and it was clear the minute you went down this driveway and kind of came out on this vista overlooking the Hudson that a spectacular sort of life had once been lived in this place. It was like something out of Edith Wharton. And in fact, Edith Wharton, of course, was a neighbor of the people who had lived in this house. So it was very much her world. And as soon as I saw it, I knew that that's where my character was. And it wasn't the kind of place I'd been looking for at all. My character was a very young woman of Japanese-American descent who was living underground as a fugitive from justice in the early 1970s because she had blown some buildings up in protest against the Vietnam War. She had started in the Bay Area, and I knew that her story was going to end in the Bay Area. But in between, she was going to be on the run, underground, living in hiding. And I realized that the problem that I'd been having with this character was that very cool and intriguing situation that had attracted me to her in the first place, the underground, on the run, in hiding thing, because she didn't have a home. She had no place. She was actually in a placeless state in her existence, and that was why I couldn't start writing. And when I saw this house, as illogical as it was that she would be there, of all places, I knew she was there. And I went home and I started writing the novel, and not only did that place just completely unstick the process of writing the book, but it turned out in a way that I really didn't fully realize until this morning when I was in the shower actually thinking about this. So this was all 12, 13 years ago. It turned out that the place wasn't an arbitrary choice at all. I somehow recognized it because I'd been doing all this research and doing all this thinking and doing all this failed writing around this project. That place, because it was a place that had to do with American power and prestige and wealth, but also the falling off of all those things, because this was a mansion that was no longer inhabited by these wealthy people, and it was falling to pieces, and it's sort of this museum of American power and wealth, but those things weren't situated there anymore. I realized it had actually been really appropriate for my character, because my character's story was in large part about negotiating these issues of American power and wealth, and always herself feeling like on the margins of that, feeling as if she didn't belong to that. And in fact, the story of the novel is she meets another fugitive from justice who happens to be from this milieu of incredible wealth and power, and it's their relationship that forms the story. So I'd actually chosen really well when I chose this place, but didn't even realize it. I just remember seeing the house and going, oh my God, this is perfect. And because I had a concrete sense of it, walking around in it, I mean, I only visited once and rushed home and started writing the book. And it wasn't until many years after the book came out that I actually went back and visited this place again and was sort of struck at how different it was from my recollection and how totally I had transformed it for my own purposes. But the truth was that I never would have written the book if it hadn't been for encountering this real place. I just probably would have wandered around with my notes indefinitely. So I wanted to talk today about, that first thing, place as it relates to your actual writing process. How to use places, what to use them for, but then also place as it's used in actual stories, its function in stories. That question that I couldn't answer for my son. Why does the setting of this book matter? Just want to make sure I'm not rambling on too indefinitely. So I want to read just a few passages and then use them to talk about these questions that I sort of wrote down when I was thinking about this. And I'll say the questions first. Keep these in the back of your mind and we'll revisit them. But my questions, and I'm sure you'll have more, the first set of questions I had were all about writing process. So I thought, does it matter where we write? And I'll be curious to hear what you guys say. Does it matter where you actually do your writing? And all writers always want to know this about each other. Where do you write? And does the place make a difference? Are certain places better than other places for writing? Is the cafe better than, Yaddo? But then I also thought, I'm going to use the word literate because I just don't know what word to use as a word that would imply this about places. But how place literate do we need to be as writers? And what I mean by that is, does it matter how well traveled we are, how many places we've experienced in our lives? Do we need to be people who have traveled the world? Are people who've had experiences in exotic realms, do they have an advantage over those of us who don't travel much? Or contrastingly, are people who are immobile, who kind of sit still and are more rooted in a certain place and more reflective and have a less hectic existence, do they have an advantage writing-wise? How does place assist in creativity? How can it inspire us or get us unstuck from writer's block? As in my story, how can places help us with the difficulties that we're having in doing our work? How much place do we need to write? How well do you need to know a place? I took a look at that house. I didn't even get to go upstairs because the tour only took you into the rooms that were safe because other rooms had falling ceilings. So, I felt like I've got to see all the rooms of this house before I can write this book, which turned out to not be true at all. So how much do we need to know about a place? I remember a famous story about Thomas Pynchon writing V, where he wrote it with a Baedeker, a travel guide. He'd never been to any of those places. He'd never been to half those cities. V like hopscotches all over Europe. This is the story. I don't know if it's true. I've never gotten to ask him, but I kind of believe it. Was it actually better if that story is true, arguably was it better for his writing that he'd never been to half those places, that he was just using the literary imagination, so to speak, to tell his story, that he wasn't impeded by too much information about a place? So how well do we need to know places? Is there a benefit to writing about places that we don't actually know anything about? Is there a benefit to faking it? And then what are the different roles that place can play in a story? What are the different things it can do? And to that end, I'm going to read just a few very short passages and then, talk about these questions. I brought more books that I'm going to read from. Because once you start browsing your bookshelf, looking for books that treat place interestingly, it becomes quite ridiculous because, of course, every story is set in a place. And so I could have brought anything. So I brought too much, and I'm just going to read a few, I think maybe 4 out of 6 of the passages that I randomly chose yesterday. So this, of course, is from Goodbye Columbus, Philip Roth. Once I'd driven out of Newark, past Irvington and the packed-in tangle of railroad crossings, switchmen shacks, lumber yards, Dairy Queens, and used car lots, the night grew cooler. It was, in fact, as though the 180 feet that the suburbs rose in altitude above Newark brought one closer to heaven, for the sun itself became bigger, lower, and rounder, and soon I was driving past long lawns which seemed to be twirling water on themselves, and past houses where no one sat on stoops, where lights were on but no windows open, for those inside, refusing to share the very texture of life with those of us outside, regulated with a dial the amounts of moisture that were allowed access to their skin. It was only 8 o'clock, and I did not want to be early, so I drove up and down the streets whose names were those of Eastern colleges, as though the township, years ago, when things were named, had planned the destinies of the sons of its citizens. I thought of my Aunt Gladys and Uncle Max sharing a Mounds bar in the cindery darkness of their alley, on beach chairs, each cool breeze sweet to them as the promise of an afterlife. And after a while, I rolled onto the gravel roads of the small park where Brenda was playing tennis. I don't know how many of you know this story, but if you know the story, you know exactly what that stepped difference between Newark and the suburbs means to the story. So that's that. This next passage is from Ali Smith's There But For The. And it's a letter, it's an excerpt from a letter that one of the main characters receives very early in the book. Dear Anna Kay, I am writing to you because my husband and I are at the end of my tether, and we are hoping to God that you will be able to help us. 10 days ago, we invited Miles Garth, who I believe you know, to dinner here at our house in Greenwich. He is a friend of a friend. We actually hardly know him, which is why this situation is so difficult and actually untenable as you can imagine. To cut a long, short story, Mr. Garth has locked himself in our spare bedroom. I am only relieved the bedroom is en suite. He will not leave the room. He is not just refusing to unlock the door and go to his own home, wherever that might be. He is refusing to speak to a single soul. It has now been 10 days, and our unwanted tenant has only communicated by one piece of paper slipped under the bottom of the door. We are slipping flat packs of wafer paper thin turkey and ham to him under the said door, but are unable to provide him with anything more dimensional because of the size of the space between said door and the floor. And this is a poem, although I don't write poetry. I like reading it, and I thought I'd bring a poem by Ada Limon from her collection, Sharks in the Rivers. It's called Homesick. In the Glen Ellen night, banned to the backyard for running in the house, I and a particular tree became fast friends in the green sequined summer. I situated myself inside it, where I watched the yellow of our kitchen window, my soundproof family. I liked the shadows cast in gobo leaf prints on my bare limbs. I imagined myself growing green sprouts and maroon bark that shot into the dark. Today in this terrible cement city, I will do this bidding, but I tell you, I am there, across from Sonoma Creek, still hidden in the tree, where I cannot be unbelieved. And I think the last... It's such a hard choice. I think the last passage that I read, I was reluctant to read this one because I realized that so many of my choices are houses, because I'm really, as you can tell from my story, house-oriented, which is surprising considering that my own house is not in very nice condition and I don't pay much attention to it. But I really like houses in writing. So I'm going to go ahead and read this one last passage from Visitation, a book that I am constantly foisting on people. And it's about house. He walks back down the stairs. On the way down, they creak at the 2nd, 15th, and second-to-last step. He himself whittled grape leaves and clusters of their fruit on the finial at the bottom of the banister. Lock the door. In his trouser pocket, the key is jingling that can open and close all the doors of the house, including the apiary and woodshed. Zess icon, a key meeting the highest safety standards, high-quality German workmanship, lock the door. And then crossing the living room, the light-colored slabs of sandstone beneath his footsteps in the entryway, 50 by 50 centimeters, the handle of the door to the vestibule made of brass, flat on top to sit well in the palm, edges grooved to offer traction to the thumb. When he depresses this handle, it emits, as always, a faint metallic sigh. The slabs of sandstone beneath his footsteps in the entryway, 30 by 30 centimeters. The birds on the door of the broom closet are flying. They've been flying there for a century. The flowers have been blossoming for a century. More grapes are hanging down. The Garden of Eden in 12 square chapters. He'd salvaged the door from an old farmhouse. Its beauty makes you forget entirely about the scrub brush, broom, bucket, dustpan, and brush it conceals. So those are 4 passages that do different things, and just the different things that I was thinking of that places can do in stories. I tried to make a list, which I'm sure is very incomplete. I thought, well, places can organize the symbolic scheme of a story, right? Kind of like Newark and the suburbs in Goodbye Columbus. There's a lot of symbolism built into the contrast between where the narrator of Goodbye Columbus lives, down there in cindery Newark, where nobody has air conditioning, and the suburb where Brenda, his love interest, lives, this sort of elevated, literally and metaphorically, suburb where people regulate with a dial the amount of moisture that's allowed access to their skin, and it's all about what sorts of access are allowed in that suburb. So in Goodbye Columbus, Philip Roth does a really great job of using those places to symbolic end. And I also thought of East and West Eggs in The Great Gatsby, which is sort of a similar contrast, where geography is used for symbolic purposes. All sorts of other ways places are used symbolically. I won't start listing them, but I'm sure you're thinking of some. I thought place can also offer a narrative structure, right? If you don't know how to organize your narrative, place can be a very simple solution to that. If you've read The Remains of the Day by Ishiguro, one of the things I love about the structure of that book is that it's made out of a road trip, right? It's so simple. Stevens, the butler, decides to go visit Miss Kenton, who used to be the maid, and he drives. He drives for 6 days, and as he's driving through the British countryside, he starts unspooling in his mind this story of their past relationship. You know, that whole novel would just be a bunch of flashbacks if it wasn't for that road trip. Because as Stevens is going through the British countryside, things are also happening to him that are kind of reflecting on the memories that he's having. So that's a way that place can be very useful in our writing, to organize a narrative, to give you kind of a shape, a vehicle. You know, I mean, Stevens also has a car. He has like a literal vehicle, and then his trip is kind of the metaphorical vehicle for his story. I thought place can actually provide you with a plot. So in There But For The, Ali Smith's book, the plot of this book is set in motion by this inexplicable act committed by this guy who's not even just a dinner guest, but he's brought along without permission by an invited dinner guest. So he's actually an unallowed +1 to a dinner, who then locks himself in an upstairs bedroom and refuses to come out for, as it turns out in the book, like months and months. It becomes like national tabloid news that this guy is in this bedroom, refusing to communicate or emerge. And it's just a terrific book. And so I thought, well, you know, place, space, actually, it's a space, it's a bedroom. It can actually galvanize an entire plot. And then one last way that I thought of was place can actually be a character. In the book Visitation that I read from last, the central so-called character of this story is actually this piece of real estate. And the book tells the story of this piece of real estate throughout the entire 20th century of Germany, as people come and go. People sort of pass through like the tide. The people are the weather, and it's the house and the land that it sits on that's kind of the protagonist. It's that story that you follow. So those were some ways that I thought of how place can matter in stories. But just to start conversing now, so that I can stop talking, I wanted to return to this initial question of place in our writing process, and ask you if you would all briefly just introduce yourselves to each other with your name and just a few words or a few sentences about a place, any place. One thing that I'd like to know is just tell us why this is the place that you're mentioning to us. And who'd like to start? I'm going to start with you.
Because I'm here.
And then we can sort of go this way. Just a few words.
Sure. I'm Zach. I'm a playwright. And the place is my in-laws' backyard in Altadena, California. And growing up on the East Coast and only wanting to ever be in New York and never leave New York, and to all of a sudden find myself on frequent trips to Los Angeles and find an incredible sense of calm and focus in that space. Sort of this and also never wanting to be in the suburbs and to find myself with this sort of laser sharp inspiration in this space in the suburbs among these trees and patios and backyard grills.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Marissa, and I'm thinking specifically of an apartment in Brasilia, which is the capital of Brazil, that I had stayed in, which was sort of luxurious compared to the journey that I was taking, which was very rough. So I'm in the middle of trying to describe this apartment, but trying to show the contrast between what I had just gone through and, what my character had just gone through and what she was experiencing in the apartment, but having some problems really capturing the difference.
Great, thank you.
My name up as well. Sorry.
My name is Kavita. Can you hear?
Yeah.
And I guess in terms of place, I'll answer one of the questions you raised right at the beginning, which is, does it matter where you write, the place that you write? So about a year ago, I transitioned from working for 15 years in the social change sector in nonprofits and foundations and government and stuff to writing full-time, particularly on a specific project that was time sensitive. And I wrestled with this idea of, well, I have a desk in my apartment, so technically everything I need, laptop, desk, books, whatnot, I really should be able to write in this space. And yet there was this feeling that I think I need a separate writing space. And it felt like a unnecessary luxury. So I decided, at the urging of my husband, who said, I think you should invest in this space, in another space for writing, and and see how it goes. And so I go to a dedicated writing space, and I find that I wouldn't say that I enjoy it, but I would say that I'm much more productive, because when I want to take a break or I get distracted, I hear the sound of like all around me, or I hear silence. So I feel like, to me, I think it's been interesting to discover that where you write does matter, at least for me, at this time.
The lack of enjoyment might be a key element.
Yes.
Thank you. Should we go back to you?
Okay. Well, right now I'm thinking of two places.
Oh, what's your name?
Well, my name is Diana.
Thank you.
I'm right now living in Bay Ridge for a few months, and Bay Ridge, I find it's a very inspiring area. There's a Verrazano Bridge.
Sorry, can you speak up a little bit?
Oh, yeah. I say right now I'm placed in Bay Ridge, and I find that's a very interesting area. So it influences a bit my writing, but I tend to read places in terms of kind of like their symbolism, like bridges and roads, empty roads and industrial areas, and I think I pick on such things because I move around a lot, and I live in different places, so I try to find some symbolism that works for me, even if I am afterwards in another place. You know, kind of like try to find some common elements that have a certain language regardless of that specific area in the end. I'm not sure whether it will work eventually to drive a whole story or a longer piece, but that's my approach to places, to find those elements which I could use to set up maybe in the end a certain mood for a story.
That's really interesting. Do you think it would be fair, because I often think of place as being specific almost by definition, but do you think it's fair to say that you sometimes almost look for universality in places, like when you said, you know, the Verrazano Bridge, or the idea of a bridge or a road, because you travel so much that you're almost looking for elements that kind of transcend their specific location?
Yeah, I think I do that, but then also you have to pin it down again, right, and find some details to pin it down. But that's definitely something that's going on in my mind when I'm trying to bring a place onto the page.
Yeah. And you could almost say that that's true of all places that work well in literature, I think, is that there's a universal aspect, and there's also that specificity, that pinning down that makes them, you know, both things at once. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Carol. I'm going to answer both things. One is this place for writing, and that is if I find myself stuck, and I do often, because I have my little place, and I live alone, so I don't have any excuses for distractions. But I find if I get up and move my computer to the opposite end of the room, or a different room in the studio, it does actually spark new ideas, and it will always be a struggle for me. I want to stay in my comfort zone, even as a struggling writer. But if I get out of it, I do so much better. And the other thing about placement, and the reason why I was interested in coming here today is because my novel is set in New Zealand, and so place is everything. It's the major antagonist and my protagonist, and I realized after even ideas that were sparked in reading about what this today might be like, that I can let place tell some of the story. I can let the weather tell some of the story. I can let again, just place, be a bigger character than I could be.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Amy, and something you said about movement, I could relate to. I live on a small farm in Vermont, and it's very peaceful, but when it gets too quiet or I feel stagnant, I find anywhere I go, to the city, I find very dull conferences on a subject you have no interest in are very, very invigorating.
Don't take it personally, though.
I don't. So just some movement, and before I go back to my desk, can help dislodge some stagnation. But I don't have a place to, and that's why I'm here. I write essays, and they're kind of dry and dull, and they need anchoring. They're a little bit too much up in the air, and I don't know how to work place. I thought maybe place could help me to anchor them, so I thought coming here I might learn something to help me write.
I hope you do. Let's come back up to the table. Do you want to speak next?
Okay, I'm Judy, and I too will try and answer both. I find that I do not do well sitting in a comfortable space at home with my computer in front of me. And I do much better sitting in a noisy Starbucks or McDonald's or someplace where there's total chaos going on around me. Then I'm able to write. The story that I'm writing or trying to write at the moment, I find is like a lot of things that I write, in that I've lived in many places around the world on different continents. When I sit down to write, I find that I'm writing about the place where I grew up, which is the American Midwest. primarily of the 1940s and 50s. And what I'm working on at present is someone who starts out there, but then goes on a road trip in the era of the hobos and moves consistently west in a very sort of American westward movement idea. And I find that the place where my main character comes from is extremely important, even as she moves through some very different environments.
Or even increasingly important as she moves
yes.
away
Absolutely.
from origin. Thank you.
I don't know which way to turn. You
can turn your back to me. I know what you're going to say.
My name is Toby, and the two questions, I would like to answer both questions because the first question about where I write is easier for me to answer. I have to be totally alone. Early in the morning, I get up, if I can wake up, and before my husband is up, and do some writing. And I found work in a neighborhood library, because when I go there, and that's later in the afternoon possibly, the table is filled with people, but I don't know them. So I can ignore them and I'm alone, and that's it. Now, for the other question, why I even came here, the toughest thing for me to do and to understand is to write about place and setting. I start off with dialogue, and I take the easy way out, and I keep going with the dialogue. And so it's really, I came here because I want to know how much do you have to put in, and how little can you put in to really set a place. What you describe, every little detail of the cups and saucers in a place, or a generalized view of a street, that's tough for me. And I realized I picked up a book yesterday, and in about 3 sentences, the author set the place. And it astounded me because I knew I could see the whole thing. It was a simple place, but I don't think it was simple to describe it for her to do that and set it. So my trouble is I'm hoping you will help me set place.
How to evoke a place. Yeah, and I would say, in the absence of actually knowing what your work is, I would say don't describe the cups. I'm pretty sure you don't have to. But it is really hard. It's very hard to know how much setting you need or how much place you need, and also when you do feel you need it, how to evoke it without a tedious sort of, it's like an architect's sort of existing conditions drawings where you just don't need that in fiction. You don't need to tell everybody where the door is located and whether it's a sash window or not, but what do you need to say? And I think that it's one of the huge challenges. I mean, I tend to feel that place is something that it insistently makes its way into my writing, and if I feel like I have to be dragging it in, there's probably something wrong. It probably doesn't have, I was about to say it doesn't have a place. The place probably doesn't have a place in the story if I feel like I'm dragging it in there. But that, I realize that's very general. Back to you, Annabella.
I'm Annabella. I would say that in most things I write, the place kind of comes to me almost first, and I imagine whatever spark I have to start happens in a specific place. And at the moment I'm trying to write something about a place that I've never been to and no one I know has ever been to, because it kind of doesn't exist any longer. It's Egypt a long, long time ago. And I'm struggling away with Baedeker, and it's very hard. You can't kind of Google map a place. You can't actually use Google Maps with Egypt, because if you have an old street name, it bears no relationship to the name of the streets now. And I don't know, it's a real challenge, which it's normally something I take for granted comes much more easily. So it's an interesting topic.
And is Egypt the sort of place, if I were to rephrase the question I started with of tell us about a place, is that the place you would tell us about? This no longer existing Egypt that you're trying to evoke?
The characters are in Egypt, so it's very much a tourist Egypt. But yeah, it no longer exists in that Egypt's so different now. So
So what period, what time period?
100 years ago. So you can read things about it, and you can look at photographs, and you can use your imagination, but it's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, it is. That's a really tough one. I never know how writers solve that problem of somehow evoking a no longer existing place that like they can't possibly have firsthand experience of. And I think that that's definitely something we should return to. But I think that like one of the things that I feel like you can't do or shouldn't do is make your efforts obvious. So it's like in the course of researching sort of a past era and learning all of the kind of anthropological or names of things, or learning about what certain relics were called, I feel like it's a really easy pit to fall into of making your research really obvious in your writing. It's like your writing is like sort of wearing your research on its sleeve, where you're like, oh, I've learned that you know, I'm just making this up because I know nothing about Egypt. I've learned that the cooking pot is called a bling blang, and so you know you're going to have your character mixing the stew and the bling blang all the time, and everybody's going to know that you like learned that out of a book about ancient Egypt. So I feel like often with trying to evoke these lost places, a lighter touch is better than a heavy one, and at the same time you need that, like Diana, like what Diana said, you need something to pin it down. You need some kind of specific texture that's going to make people believe in that place. So how do you do it? And I often find writers I know who manage to do this well, I sometimes think that one thing that they're doing is that they're bringing things very, very frequently back to the body of the character, to the physical, the immediate physical experience of the character, so that instead of sort of randomly describing architectural elements off here, it's, you know, there's often like some really well-chosen detail about walking down that street or encountering that object or something that feels very motivated by what's happening to the character in that moment, but that also is a little bit of texture that's kind of specific to that time period. You know, who's really good at it? I was actually just reading an unpublished writer who's writing about the early Victorian period, and she was really good at this unpublished writer, and one of the things that she kept doing was she kept sort of giving you a sense of exactly how it felt to be that character in a given moment, and the character runs away and is frightened and is kind of hiding against a wall, and the wall is a very particular kind of British wall with like big irregular chunks of stone. There's things growing out from in between the chinks of it, and the road is not paved and it's all dirty, and she like her frock is like stained up to her knees, and she's kind of huffing and puffing because she's been running away. But you have this sense of the physical environment, this kind of Victorian physical environment of unpaved roads and scary masonry, irregular masonry, that somehow to me made that moment come alive and seem really like Victorian England, because I think it was so much about what was happening to that character in that moment. And she wasn't sort of saying like, oh, my overbonnet was dirty. I didn't make up these terms, I don't even know what they are. But she wasn't using a bunch of jargon. She was just using sort of very immediate physical experience to give you a sense of the place. Anyway, do you want to go next?
Hi, my name's Eric. I love how place, the complexity of a place is a great way to start off with the complexity of a character. A lot of the places that I write about probably are spawned from an experience 30 years ago when my mother and I did a reverse commute of Philip Ross and drove from the suburbs and went down to a decrepit dock in Jersey City before Jersey City was gentrified. It was July 4th, and the fireworks were being shot out over the Statue of Liberty. Off of this, we're all standing on this dock, all kinds of people. The dock is the creosote, stinking wood that they don't use anymore. There's holes in it, but it's waterfront. It's beautiful. You don't know what's floating in the water, but it's still beautiful. And the fireworks are beautiful. The Statue of Liberty is beautiful, and Jersey City's not beautiful. and it was a great experience for my mother and I. So I think it all kind of spawns from that.
Can I ask how old you were when that happened?
I drove, so I was probably 17.
But still.
And had no idea where I was going, and parked between burnt out cars in our Pontiac.
Right. Right. Because I was going to say, I mean, you weren't a child because you were driving, but at the same time you were still relatively inexperienced. You didn't know where you were going. I think another thing that I find interesting sometimes about reading writers who I think do really well with place is that I sometimes wonder if they're doing what I find myself doing often, which is that I often find myself choosing the elements of landscape that I remember from childhood. It's a bit, I often fear, of a cheat, but at the same time I think there's something about the things that you notice when you're young and that stay with you that it's not just inherent to those things, although clearly there must be something to them if they stuck with you, but also your relationship to those things, hanging on to them in memory for such a long time, it kind of infuses those things with extra double special significance, so that I'll often find that little bits of recovered landscape from my childhood recollections will work their way into my current writing and be more effective. I don't know if it's because it's just a more effective thing and that's why I remember it, or if the fact of my remembering it makes me depict it in a more effective way. But an example is that, I grew up in the Midwest too, and I think of it as an unremarkable landscape. At the upper surface of my mind, I think, oh, the Midwest, so unspectacular, so flat, so monotonous. But I have this memory from riding the bus in my childhood of a cornfield that had this big dent in it where a huge tree had been allowed to remain because clearly the dent was too deep for anybody to deal with plowing it. So they had just made the cornfield around it, and the tree was sort of like this enormous thing, and the dent was, in my recollection, really deep, and it was kind of like this strange oasis of a spreading tree of some kind in the middle of this desert of gold corn. And I found myself using that image in my writing, years and years and years and years and years later. And I used it for a character who was remembering his youth in a place very different from where he'd wound up. And I thought, well, I hope it worked. But I thought if it does work, I feel like maybe it's working because it's like one of the few it's like this little piece of random flotsam stuck in my brain. And if it's stuck there, I was 7 years old when I rode that bus. I'm 45 now. Like, if it's stuck there for that many years, is it just me, or is there something kind of vivid about that image? And so I think it's kind of interesting to plumb your own youth for those like little random bits of like just the flotsam and jetsam that's in your memory. And you don't have to use it for a scene that in any way resembles the scene of your youth, but you can just take it and use it somewhere else. And I do that a lot. And I find that it often is quite effective. And I don't think it's just because I have like really decorative stuff from my youth. Like I said, I grew up in the suburbs in the Midwest. It's like not a super memorable looking scene. So the few things I pulled out of it I think are memorable.
Hi, my name is Tabitha, and I'm a psychology professor, so I have an office, a lovely office on campus, but I find it very, very difficult to write fiction there. I do academic writing there. I'm a different person there. So I can write in many different places, but not in that office. There's something about it that's just, I feel very different when I'm there. I have a very different way of kind of viewing the world, of writing, of thinking there, that quite honestly is soul-crushing. And then when I do, because it's such a formulaic kind of writing, scientific writing, whatever that is. And so to do fiction writing, I have to be in another space. In terms of writing about place, I tend to write in a very micro way about place rather than macro. So when you said writing about a house, I actually grew up, my family owned a tavern, and so I grew up in a tavern, and it's just a miraculous space to write about because there's so much in a tavern. But I don't go outside of that. So I often wonder how macro do you need to be when you're talking about place or space? Does it have to be located in a town, in a time, in a state, in a country, or can it be in that really kind of localized way of space? So that's one of the things that I grapple with.
That's such a great thing to have to write about. I envy that. It's hard to know not knowing what exactly you're writing, but I have to say, like, to me, the great thing about having a tavern as a place to write about, apart from how cool that sounds, is clearly it's full of people coming in and out. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that is going to give you the macro, right? Mm-hmm. Because the people coming in and having encounters and relationships and conversations even, they're going to probably bring in as much of the context for that tavern as you really need. Right. So I don't know if you need to worry about telling us, like, what street corner it's on or what neighborhood it's in or what town that neighborhood is in, or et cetera, because I feel like that stuff is going to come in as necessary with the people who come in the door.
Which is interesting because the place is so fluid.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. It's constantly changing. Even time of day, completely different. Clientele, feel, mood. So.
Yeah. That's great. Are those of you in back with us or observing, or do you want to, should we keep moving this way?
I would say go that way first.
Okay, so do you want to go next?
My name is Jan, and I've lived in New York most of my life, and I find that when I write the setting without my intending it always ends up being New York, but it's a symbolized New York. So somehow the park might become a river that needs to be crossed. So it becomes Metropolis, but the people, not New York, but the people do New York kind of things and have New York kind of concerns, and yet it's not the emotional and mythological reality of it is more important than the specific physical reality. It gets transformed a bit.
Is there a particular place in New York that you could mention to us now as just maybe something you're thinking of or wanting to write about, or just if you could choose one spot in the city that you know so well, just off the top of your head?
Okay, well, I guess in the example I gave, this particular story, it was a New York situation with people who have kind of New York careers. I wrote it in a workshop, and everyone, and at first I said it was Pittsburgh because they had all these rivers in Pittsburgh, and I wanted the rivers because of ancient Greek mythology, Hades and all the rivers that run into Hades. And the teacher said, these are New York people, this is a New York story. And
this is not Pittsburgh.
No, it's not. So I brought it back to New York, but I had to name it Metropolis because if somebody was moving from the west side to the east side, crossing the park didn't have quite the same significance as crossing the river. And so I called it Metropolis, but to keep it a little ambiguous and symbolic. So it was still New York, but if I saw somebody in reality sitting by a lake, and crying, I had to turn it into a river to kind of link in to the Greek mythology.
Should we come here?
Sure. I'm Barbara. I live in Trinidad, and so Trinidad is the place I write about. I was very interested to hear about the places where people go to escape from distraction. It's impossible to escape from distraction if you live in a very small island. So, and if I went into a coffee shop or a library in the hope of finding peace and quiet, I'm sure to meet somebody that I know. And if I don't, I'm sure to make sure that I know before leaving, that person who is sitting there, whom I've never met before, make that person my friend. So I am as much the cause of my distraction as my location. When I write at home, and distraction finds me. I have 2 landlines, a cell phone. I don't ever watch TV, so I can't blame TV for distraction. But a lot of my friends are like me, retired people who are idle all day long, and they call me at all hours of the day, and they are friends, you don't turn them down. But some of my writing is done between all of that. I thought I needed quiet, and I rented an apartment in Tobago, the neighboring island, that had no internet and no phone, and I left my cell phone behind. And I did quite a lot of writing. When I got back home and read it, it was tediously boring. And I realized that perhaps I needed the energy of distraction. I have only recently started writing, so I'm still finding out what works for me, and distraction does, I think. Right now, I was happy to hear about your tavern. I'm writing a story set in a pub in a kind of gentrifying neighborhood. When I was growing up, it was a very poor, lower-class neighborhood, but now it's becoming gentrified, as places near the city center tend to do. This is just on the fringes of Port of Spain, the capital. And it's a pub, and the protagonist has been left by her partner, and he's gone to live in Canada without warning. He went with a steel band and just didn't come back. So she's left with this place and is trying to make it her own. And so the place is quite important. How she makes it her own is by trying to understand herself first in this solitary space where she is. So the place grows under her hand as her sense of self grows in her mind, I think. Okay.
It sounds wonderful, and also what better use of a place to not just provide plot, because her struggle to make this place her own, as you say, is going to be, sort of the plot of your story, but it also functions in a wonderful symbolic way because the pub was run by her lover or her
yes, they bought it together and now were running it together,
now
but
he's
she didn't have
her.
very much to do with it.
Right.
And now he's gone, and his best friend from childhood is the barman, who knew that he was going, but didn't tell her because he's more her husband's friend than hers. So there is this barman who knows his own backstory. She's a stranger to the country. She didn't grow up there. So she's getting to know the country and how to run the bar, and herself in this alien space. It wasn't alien before because
Right.
she had the comfort of her husband.
Right. But it's alien now without him, and she has to make it.
Yes,
it's
she has to
wonderful.
make it work.
It's wonderful. Let me go back to you.
Hi, I'm Elisa. To answer the question that first bit at the beginning, I guess I, like Barbara, I'm trying to find out a place that really works for me. I live on a very noisy street with roommates in a very small apartment, so where I sleep is often where I do my writing and practically everything else. And the inspiration that I get, I like to run with it, obviously, like everybody else, but it comes in fits and spurts, so I find myself, if I have something that comes to me in the morning, and I try and really ride the wave of that for as long as I can. Sometimes at night, when I get home late from work, sometimes my mind is still active, and then I usually ride that wave. So but it's been a struggle of trying to find a place for me to write that's the most productive and the most effective for a story that I want to write or complete, as opposed to just a stream of consciousness that will help me sort of either fall asleep or become more alive in the morning. I was really excited to see this particular workshop because I'm also struggling with developing some kind of story that really is set in a place that I've been to only twice in my life. But both times I've been there were very impactful moments in my life, and I struggle with creating a character or developing a character that is experiencing things that I don't necessarily want to be my own experiences, but we were talking about cheating before, and like Eric in the 4th of July, and I guess like the mansion, you know, my memory of a certain place, how much do I need to create? I guess is my question. How much should I go off of memory? And I don't know what will serve my story best, so it's oftentimes difficult for me to differentiate the two, and I don't know which path to take whenever I sit down to write this particular story, which has several different incarnations, and I'm trying to produce like the most effective one, I guess.
Are you wondering about how much to create in terms of writing about the place itself and the character's experience of it?
I think so. I think because the place is I just can't seem to shake it, and it's all that I mean, for this particular project, I try to write something else, and I can't. I keep coming back to it. So I think there's something there about the place.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm not really sure how much of it is just to like envelop the character and characters, or how much of it is maybe its own character. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's
different things.
Right. I think that, well, I think that that's something that you'll probably not find out until you finish whatever it is. But I think that the experience that you're having is really great, because I often feel like what I was saying to you before about this question of how do you get place into your work, I feel like it's more a question of like, once it intrudes, don't try to push it out, but trying to artificially drag it in, maybe you know that it doesn't belong in that particular piece. But I think what you have happening is really exciting and productive, because I do really think that a lot of writing is, you know, without sounding sort of mystical or psychological about it, I do think a lot of your most successful writing ends up coming out of stuff that for whatever reason is nagging at you, or just failing to let you be, you know, and I think that the fact that you're kind of following that impulse and continuing to like visit this place in your writing and trying to figure out what you need to be writing about it is definitely the right impulse, because you know, often so much of this stuff is at a gut level, I think, and with place in writing, I think actually just like listening to your gut and understanding that if you sort of pursue what your gut is telling you to do, it's probably going to lead to a more interesting place than if you do otherwise. I think that that's one of the things to realize, that there's like nothing wrong and everything right about sort of going, well, I sort of feel like doing this, so I guess I will, instead of trying to impose an artificial situation on yourself, instead of saying, you know, for example, I should write a story set in Rome because Rome's a glamorous place, and trying to force yourself to do that when possibly you have no real interest in Rome. I do think also that the role of memory is a really interesting one, because I often find that I get more and better writing out of trying to use memory and sort of wring it out, rather than trying to supplement it with more research. This is a strange, like, figure out how it works for yourself thing, but I've written about places that I barely remembered and yet felt a weird compulsion to write about. And they've been places that I could have gone back to and re-examined, and I've decided not to, because there was something in the quality of the nagging that the place was imposing on me that I felt was what was making the writing work, if that makes sense. And I felt like if I go back and actually look at the place and am flooded with all of the particularities of that place, all of the information, it's going to blow it somehow.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you think that's why you only went to that decrepit house once?
Definitely. Definitely, because I felt like in that case, once was enough. It dislodged something, and actually, like, my vision of what that character was doing immediately just sort of took off on its own. As soon as I had the barest sense of the place that she was, I was able to just start imagining the rest of it, and I didn't really want that process to get hamstrung by too much real-world information, because I thought if I go back and look at it again, I'm going to see all this stuff that sort of imposes itself on me as being intellectually interesting, but maybe it didn't come from the gut, and so it's going to confuse me. It's going to be too much information. I mean, in the same book, because I decided she was there, I decided that a character is seeking her. He's actually pursuing her, and she doesn't want to be found. And so I have him in the town looking for her. I was so leery of sort of spoiling how well this place was working for me by getting to know it that I wrote all of that character's scenes in that town with a completely erroneous sense of what the town was. It's Red Hook, New York. I don't know who's been there. I drove up and down this road and saw signs that said Red Hook, and there was just almost nothing there. And I decided that's what Red Hook must be, and so that's how it is in my book. And I later discovered, after the book was published, that there was actually a whole town off the road with like a main street and all this stuff that I had never known about. People actually said to me, like, why did you describe Red Hook in such a peculiar way, like as only consisting of a diner? Because there's actually a main street, did you know? And I said, no, and I didn't want to. I was like, I just didn't want to know. So in a way, I feel like, and you're writing fiction, so you don't have that burden of getting it right for the sake of its existence in the world. You're just trying to get it right for your story. I got Red Hook totally wrong in terms of how it actually looks, but it didn't matter in the end, because for storytelling purposes, I had enough of it. And the same with, I had another book that was set at a university campus that I had visited as a child. And although my character in the book is a grown man, somehow my heightened recollection of it from childhood felt like the right amount to know. Because I just remembered the hills being really tall and the buildings being really large, and certain aspects of it were so sort of alienating and surreal and beautiful, and my character was a foreigner coming to this place for the first time, and he's a fish out of water, to use a cliche. And I thought, I don't actually want to go see that university as an adult, because I have a feeling it'll shrink and it won't look the way I want it to look to this newcomer. So I never went there until my book was published. And again, I got all of the names, all of the buildings wrong. And yet I identified the university as being this particular place in this particular town, but I got all the building names wrong and all the layouts wrong. And I went there to that town and read from the book, and people said, why didn't you? People were sort of mildly offended that I had so...
And no one sues you?
No one sues... Well, it's a novel. That's the great thing about writing fiction. The great thing about fiction is that you can say, it's a novel. I decided not to use the real building names. So I think that there's something about how a place implants itself in your memory that's kind of valuable. And sometimes I would rather struggle against not being able to see the whole thing than go and supplement my recollection with research, which I feel like will sort of throw off my sense of what I want out of that place. I don't know if that makes sense. Back there in the back.
Hi, I'm Ella, and I'm writing a novel that's set in two places, and from a writing perspective, they're completely different experiences, because one place was set in the house where I grew up, which is in a small village on the northeast coast of England. So I could write about this place almost entirely from memory, and it was very nice to write from the perspective of childhood, because it impacts you, places impact you in such a different way when you're a child. And then the second place was in Barbados, the Caribbean, where my father grew up. And I did this, I'd only been to Barbados a couple of times on holiday, and I started to write about a childhood in Barbados, but just from research and other books and my imagination. So So it was a completely different experience. And actually, when the book was almost finished, then I went to Barbados to see the set. So, and I don't know, it worked very well for me because I've written most of my character's experience from my imagination and research and ideas.
And then with that research trip, you could enhance what you'd already...
Yes, because it's so, for me, it's so different to feel a place and be in a place and get the energy of the place. Just when you're actually writing, trying to find somewhere to write, just the energy of where you are affects how you write. You know, you went to this quiet place and you thought your prose was very tedious, and yet being in a cafe with lots of energy and chaos somehow affects your prose as well. So I have the same experience.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mimi, and I actually wrote a novel about Shanghai, where I had worked for like a few months at a time. And yeah, interestingly, I never worked on this book while I was living there. It was always after, when I was back in the States, remembering it. And specifically, like I found myself very obsessed with the French concession in Shanghai, which is this like really picturesque little, kind of like the West Village or something, plopped in the middle of the city because it's where all the Europeans, specifically where the French like settlers lived before, and they have these buildings that look very, you know, like European, like these old European facades, and then, you know, these beautiful sycamore trees lining the streets. And then outside of that is like where all the huge skyscrapers are jutting out against, you know, this otherwise little bubble. But it was, you know, interesting in writing about some place that I felt was sort of loaded because, you know, obviously I have my experience living there and what I remember, and I had people reading it who had been there and people reading it who had not been there. And so I feel like there was, you know, certain expectations for what it was supposed to be. I actually like had an editor say like he wished there was more China in my book, which I found so confusing because I was like, but I said it in this place that was so real to me. So I almost felt like maybe he was looking for something specific, like there was an expectation there because it's supposed to be this very well-known place. So I don't know, that's like a question I have, like how do you write about something that, you know, maybe is not so obscure, a place you're describing that is, you know, populated with tourists. Like I've never even tried to write about New York City because I feel like, you know, there's so much literature out there about it that I wouldn't even know how to start.
So do you feel like because it's such a well-known place, descriptive passages would kind of be redundant because your reader's likely to already know what that place
Well, it was a weird balance
like?
because, yeah, I found myself like, how do I describe a place for if someone had never been there, you know, for them to get enough of a sense to be in the story. But I also didn't want to over-describe for, you know, for someone who had lived there even longer than I had. And they would be like, oh yeah, like, duh, that's where that is.
Right. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think, again, I feel like, I don't know if this is the answer, but when you posed your question, I thought of something, so I'll just voice it, which is that I always feel like if whatever description of a place you're providing is really grounded and anchored in plot or character and something that's really specific to your story, I feel like it can't be redundant. And I don't know, I guess as an example, I'm thinking of a piece of nonfiction that I read that was so delightful and that was such a great piece of writing about place, but it's a book by Edmund White called The Flaneur. I don't know if anyone knows his work, but he's an American writer who lived for many years in Paris, and it takes the form of, he takes a walk in Paris, and he knows Paris inside out, backwards and forwards, and he talks about as he's walking about. He talks about his favorite walk, where he steps outside and sort of starts walking through the Latin Quarter, and he's looking at things, and and regarding things on the street, and at the same time he's thinking about France, and he's thinking about the people that he knows, and he's telling anecdotes all in the form of this walk that he's taking. And I was reading it in Paris and thinking, this is the perfect book, because for someone who's never been to Paris, and for someone who's not even in Paris, it gives you so much of Paris. It's so specific, and the one thing that you really need is a map, because you want to open up a map and say, oh, okay, he's walking down Boulevard Saint-Germain. I know he's going into the Faubourg Saint-Germain, so I know he's walking this way, and you can sort of follow him. If you've been to Paris, you don't even need the map, but if you've been to Paris a million times, you couldn't possibly be bored by this book, because it's about him, it's about his relationship to Paris, funny things that have happened to him, things he's noticing on the street that even if you know that they're there, the way he takes notice, the things that they make him think of are all so unique that it's a delight. It's a delight for the person who's very familiar with where he's writing about, and a delight for the person who's never been there. So I thought there was something so effective about the way he was writing about that place, and maybe it's again about this specificity, pinning it down to the experience of the narrator, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, and at the same time providing such a wealth of detail that a person who's never been to Shanghai is still going to be able to orient themselves, but a person who's been there is not going to feel bored or as if they're being told things that they don't need to know.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that kind of reminds me of Open City. I just finished reading that by T.G. Cole. It's like, oh, I know exactly. He's at Columbus Circle. He's walking through Harlem. And, like, even living in the city, it's kind of lovely to read somebody else's interpretation.
Right, because it's their interpretation. That's exactly the thing. It's not some sort of disembodied, tour guide saying Columbus Circle is located at the southwestern corner of Central Park. But it's actually this character's experience of the place.
I think there's also an element of exoticization of this is a whole other conversation to do, being Asian American and what people's expectations are. I have a friend who wrote a memoir and she had the same comment, but it wasn't really Chinese.
Right.
And it's like, what is Chinese to you? What is you have your interpretation of it.
I also felt like that's the point of a city like Shanghai. It's really
and it is very
cosmopolitan.
Right.
Yeah, there's so many Americans living there,
and then there's the Bund and stuff, and people really, if you live there, you can just be a completely expat life. You don't have to speak to any Chinese people really there. So that is, it's to do with all perceptions and what people expect and what they want or what they think they want to buy and all that stuff.
It is to do with perception, and I think I was going to say that I think the editor who expressed disappointment that there wasn't enough China in what you'd written, I think is almost a testament to what a good job you did, because you're like, well, I didn't write about the China that you envision, whatever it is, but about Shanghai, which is this very different idea from clearly the preconceptions that person brought to it. I mean, they were obviously looking for some really specific China of their mind that wasn't what you were writing about. But I think you're absolutely right, and especially with the exotic locale, aka the lesser known locale. I think people often bring these really specific expectations, but I think most writers would be happy to have their expectations surprised. Editors are always second guessing what they think readers want. I think most readers actually want their expectations to be thwarted or surprised and not met every time. Why don't we go to you next?
I'm Nicole, and I guess I'm a little bit nomadic at the moment, so for me it's a case of being able to write anywhere. I've written places with no electricity and things like that, or equally in New York and in cafes or public libraries or things like that. So I guess in a way it's about what Pico I said about where is your place? Your place is home. Your home is you. So I had to make it that way because of my experiences. And I guess for me, why I was interested in this workshop is that, I find I'm working also on a novel, and the place keeps changing as the more research that I do develops. And I think it was interesting what you said about struggling against the memory, using that instead of getting confused by the research. As for me, as I've gone along, everything gets bigger, and I'm struggling now between where to set the place, because I'm interested in Tibet and India, and I've been to Tibet and I'm going to India, and they're very interlinked. So hopefully it won't be set in Czechoslovakia, but but because of that, the more that I discover about my characters and the reality of their situations and what things would happen, the more I get confused as to where to set it. I mean, for example, my main character is a doctor, but then after I started writing and after I started researching, I realized that there are very few doctors in China. Sorry, foreign aid doctors in China, because it's so difficult to get in. And then I thought I would move the action to India. But through researching that, I've discovered that the bodies that I thought worked in there may work in there, but on different projects and not necessarily on the thing that I was hoping for. So, yeah, I guess and of course, as you develop the plot and things like that, and it's very specific to the place. So then I get confused as to it's all these other things, and then politics as well, and yeah. So for me, I guess it's all sort of tied in together. That was very complicated.
No, but that's really interesting what you're saying about how you have like elements of character and plot that aren't, you're not able to accommodate them with one place because it's not realistic, right? So you had to switch places.
And I know it's to do with obviously fiction and it's imagination, but I have this need to make some things accurate, or at least go from a place that at least starts some kind of reality.
Right, right. And I should say, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, because I feel like this question of accuracy with regard to place is really important, because it's not, you can't really dispense with it, even if it is fiction. Like, I know I was very cavalier about that, but the truth is, you kind of, when you can dispense with accuracy and when you can't, right? And like when it's a question of the names of buildings on a university campus that's never even sort of named in the book, it's just like everyone who knows that campus knows where it is, but that's not terribly important. But what you're talking about is, because that, if you're putting a character in a place where there's no such person like that likely to be in that place, that sort of threatens the whole credibility of your story. So, don't think that I'm saying, oh, just throw accuracy out the window. It's just don't obsess over accuracy where it doesn't matter. But then where it does matter, it becomes a much bigger challenge.
Yeah, and I guess I've been looking at stuff to do with human rights and to do with particular situations that are actually in specific countries, so you can't just make it up.
Yeah.
I mean, you could, but I mean, in a different kind of novel.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. People always ask the question of sort of what do you start with when you're writing, and I always feel like it's hard to start with less than a situation. You can start without a plot, but I feel like situation is usually sort of the baseline. And by situation, I mean, I guess I can't. I'm just going to say that word. By situation, I mean character plus the situation they're in, the context that they're in, and almost always for me that includes some basic geographic information, like, my character who was a fugitive from justice, I knew that she was in the U.S. You know what I mean? I knew that she was an American who had broken American laws, who was a fugitive from American justice in America. Like, I knew that she hadn't left the country, because if I did have her outside of the country, that's a completely different story with completely different rules. And so even that situation, like those things were defined. And then, the freedom that I had was, well, where in the U.S. is she? Exactly. But I knew at least what nation she was in, because switching nations switches too much.
Characters that in India or Tibet, probably on the border, which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and that is a geographically.
But it's interesting because, I mean, you can't just be like, oh, I'm just going to lift the things from Tibet and slam it into India, because obviously, like, the political situation is so different.
Right.
The freedom of speech. I mean, one of the problems I had going to China is that there was no freedom of speech, so I couldn't talk about the things that I wanted to talk about. So I came away with a different perception of what I thought Tibet would be. But in anticipation of going to India, I'm like, well, I should be able to talk about what I want to talk about, because there won't be political issues there. Very political in that region. but then I'll also be dealing with Tibetans in India, which, and again, is a separate situation. And anyway, boring story, but yeah,
that's very interesting, but very complicated.
But in that way, it changes it from something that is, you know, the way that Tibetans live in Tibet and the way that Tibetans live in India, and how that changes the plot, how that changes the characters, and how it changes what they're capable of doing.
Right, right. And it's such a actually great illustration of, because I keep coming back to your cups, your teacups, and thinking, you know, the project that you're doing is so clearly an example of a project in which place is critical to plot and character, and that isn't always the case. Really, with that book that my son was reading, I just felt like place wasn't that critical to the story of that kid in school. I mean, I you know, obviously, like if that child had been in a completely different culture or in a completely different time period, the plot would not have involved Clearasil and things like that. But so again, coming back to your teacups, I feel like you know when place is critical to your story, and you know when place can a little bit fade into the background and be background. Because I feel like, you know, background is almost this different thing. You know, background is background. You can ignore it, but place is always more central in my mind.
My name is Felicity, and I'm actually a nonfiction writer. And I'm writing a biography of a 20th century historical character. But I'm not writing an academic book. And so place becomes very important in my book because he worked abroad. He worked in many countries. And I don't want to just say, well, this was what was happening historically and so on. So I paint a picture. Where he lived, the country, the town, the house, where he walked, as much detail, so that the reader is getting history, but is also getting a sense of place. A lot of my, and by the way, I have some ideas for you of where to find stuff on Egypt. A lot of
success, problem solved.
I don't know if it's solved, but a lot of what drives my narrative is my own sense of place, because I grew up living in 25 different countries. And so place is important, but belonging to place is of absolutely no interest to me at all. And even living in New York, I've lived in 11 different apartments. Because what place means to me is where I am at the moment. But how I've come to appreciate the place is by moving. And even in my apartment, and this has to do with my writing too, because as long as it's quiet, I can write anywhere. But even in my apartment, the furniture gets changed, the paintings on the walls get changed, because if they stay the same, I don't see them anymore. I mean, how many times do you look at stuff that's on your walls, or and you just don't see it anymore? You took so much trouble to go and buy it and choose it and hang it, or you know, the table or whatever, and then you never see it again. And so I find that this helps my writing, because it jostles me without, you know, having some, you know, outwardly experience. If I change the furniture, or I change whatever, I start seeing things differently, and then I go back to my writing and I start seeing places differently. I start seeing the subject differently. You know?
I think that's I love what you said about how, as you know, as soon as you place something, it vanishes, because I have the same experience. And I think, I mean, would you say that your writing also tends to always be about some place where you don't happen to be located?
Correct.
And that is probably a benefit. Because I think that's something that's really interesting in terms of writing, not just about physical place, but I actually think also in writing about historical place, in writing about events. I actually think that it's much easier to write about. I mean, we always say, oh, you need the perspective. But I mean, it's more than that. I just think it's much easier to write about events when you have moved so far beyond them that they really feel like a separate place. It's like another location in your history that you're that you're regarding sort of from a distance, in the same way that I think it's easier to write about physical places when you're not in them. Maybe because of this sense that I always have of being like overstimulated by a physical place, where when I'm trying to write about a place where I happen to be, I have that same, I'm obsessed with your cups. You can see what my issue is. Too many details. If I'm trying to write about my kitchen, which I would never do, but let's say I would never sit in my kitchen and try to do that, because I would sit there describing the cups, and I would probably have to leave my kitchen and cross the ocean, and also like leave my kitchen behind by about 20 years, and then I could write about it and try to capture what might have mattered about it. So I do feel like this displacement that you're talking about is something that for me is definitely applicable in all the work that I do, even though I write nonfiction. I mean, even though I write fiction and you write nonfiction. Pardon me. Can we go back to you folks back there? Hi.
I actually am observing. I'm covering this work. I have a question. You mentioned was Edmund White the author that you mentioned?
Of the book about Paris, yes.
What's the name of the book?
It's called The Flaneur.
Oh, okay.
And the flaneur is sort of a French. Flaneur is a French term for a gentleman who walks about with no purpose. And Edmund White in his book is being a flaneur, or trying. He's trying to walk about with no purpose, and it's. You were talking about how you had trouble getting settings into your nonfiction writing, because I feel like that would be a wonderful book for you to look at, because, I mean, the book it's on the surface very simple. It's a book about a walk, and he describes, he takes a walk and he talks to you about the walk that he's taking, but it ends up being about everything, including, I think most interestingly, like national character, because he talks about how Americans just don't know how to walk around with no purpose, and the French do, and he's trying to sort of walk about in the French manner, but he's an American. And so it's wonderful because he actually makes the geographical location, it's the whole raison d'etre of that essay, is that he's walking around. It's wonderful. So,
Hi, my name is Jeanette. I'm also covering the magazine.
Okay.
In the Philippines. But I do have a question. In terms of drawing from secondhand memory, because you can do interviews, you can ask people, how do you feel about that? How would you make it work?
Secondhand memory? I think secondhand memory is ooh, I like it, because I think it's becoming clear that one of my particular struggles with writing is I have trouble curating the stuff in my head and deciding what's worth using and what is not, because it's my head, and so it's all there. That's why I use memory a lot, because I also have a very bad memory. So my mystical feeling is always, if my memory hung on to it, it must be of value, to me at least. With secondhand interviews, what's so nice is that it's already curated for you, because what someone chooses to tell you is always going to be so much more selective than what you've experienced for yourself. So I've struggled with really wanting to use that kind of material and being in situations where it wasn't at all appropriate, and I had to deny myself that sort of material. And so a situation in which it was appropriate, and it's all about personal relationships, I wrote a novel that was based on my father's life, but very much fictionalized. And I interviewed my own father. Maybe you did a similar thing with your Barbados story, or?
Well, unfortunately, my father had passed away by the time I started writing, but I definitely drew on conversations that I had with him.
Right.
Other family
He'd talked to you and he'd told you about his
accounts.
childhood.
A little bit, but other family, I kind of piecemealed a lot of different first-hand information together. And I think the nice thing about second-hand memory is you don't get bogged down by the physicality of a place because you're looking at it. You more remember how you felt about it. And I think that's a really nice thing about sitting, how it makes you feel, how
Right.
it affects you.
Right. That's a great point. And I think that the physicality, the extent to which the physicality of a place comes in via those sorts of memories, is always a really good clue as to what you should use in a description and what maybe you should leave out. Those elements of a physical place that are connected to emotion and memory. But what I was going to say, just to finish the thought about secondhand, is I did interview my father quasi-formally. I mean, we had conversations, but also when I started working on this this thing, I actually started more formally asking him questions and taking notes. And that was a situation in which it was my father, and he knew exactly what I was up to, and I felt that I could negotiate our relationship and our shared relationship to what I was writing, and I felt like it would probably work out all right, and it did. But in other situations in which I've written novels that are loosely based on historical events, and I was very tempted to try to go and interview still living people who had been involved in those events, I did my best to resist, because I felt like I was going to get into an interpersonal situation that was going to get tricky, in large part having to do with how I was going to represent things. Because I'm a fiction writer, I was going to represent them my own way, and I felt like interviewing people about their experiences and then representing their experiences in a way that probably was not going to be what they expected, inevitably, just because it's me representing it and not them. I just felt like that was going to become too complicated.
Even in nonfiction, it happens all the time.
I know. And in fact, one of the ways in which I became so acutely aware of this was that for many years I worked as a fact checker checking nonfiction. And so always kind of walking that line between one person's first-person account of events and a second person's journalistic account of those events drawn from the primary source. And there was constantly a very large gap between those two things that in the minds of usually the interviewee. And so that was something that I was really leery of in writing fiction.
Hi.
Hi.
My name's Jane, and I think it's very funny that Bedeckers has come up a couple of times, because I started a city guidebook series, so actually that's kind of how I write about place right now. So the fiction is more aspirational, and I do a lot of new media projects that are very much about capturing psychogeography. So
I've never heard that term.
Yeah, well, if the other book you should read is Psychogeography by a guy who refers to the Flanier and the White Book. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's neat stuff. It's kind of the qualitative or experiential perspective of place. So
great.
But anyway, so the place that just came into my mind when you asked that question was just almost a very transient interstitial place or space that I pass through, and it's the bridge between New Hampshire and Maine. And as I pass over it, the entire, like my dogs, me, the car, it just changes, because everything about the air changes right as you go over the bridge. So the smell of the air, the feel of the air, the temperature, and it's kind of like you've entered the place. And it's just so concisely intense. And it doesn't happen slowly across Massachusetts. It's just like this very intense switch of place. So that's what
incredible.
Came into my head when you asked the question.
I want to drive over that bridge.
Yeah, and my dogs too.
What's the bridge going
pop
over?
Up and their ears go up.
Oh, that's
it's going over this river. Yeah, that splits New Hampshire from Maine.
Right, I don't even know what that river is.
Kosciuszko Bridge or something, and which is hilarious because we have a Kosciuszko Bridge, so I'm like,
which is sort of
that's
much less evocative,
parallel.
I think.
Yeah, totally. You're usually sitting traffic on this one, So, yes, I don't know.
That's fantastic.
And it's very the Portsmouth area is really industrial, and then you just pass across into just trees.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting.
Oh, that's wonderful. Wonderfully evoked, too. And that's a great example, going all the way back to your mention of bridges and the specificity and the universality, because bridges are such a great symbol, but every bridge is different.
Air at night is also such a great symbol.
Yeah,
right?
all of it. It's just incredible.
It's wonderful, but I love the vision of your dog. I don't even know what kinds of dogs you have, and yet your description of the dog sort of pricking up their ears and becoming more alert as you pass over the midpoint of the bridge is...
It's kind of shocking that they're as tuned to it as I am.
Yeah, but that's also a wonderful way to describe a place. I mean, I think this keeps coming back to the question of how do we describe places, and I think describing that place and the effect that it has in terms of the way your dogs react to it, and the fact that it's a repeated reaction was just, that worked so beautifully. You didn't have to tell me what the bridge looked like.
Didn't have to fill in a lot of blanks.
Yeah, exactly. That really did it. Yeah.
Do you change as you go over the bridge such that the dogs are picking up your energy?
I'm sure that's.
Are they reacting
I'm sure
to
that's
you,
part
or
of
are they
it.
reacting?
But I
which is
actually,
still-
I've tried to do little scientific experiments measuring this, because there's also, not to get too detailed in the workshop, but there's also another point where we turn onto our street in Maine that they go nuts. And it's, if you just witness it, it's really, I'm doing nothing. Like, I'm doing nothing.
So interesting. And also,
Yeah.
they know where they're going
and it's
all
a lot
the while.
The smell, I think, because
But
the
it's these
smells
two-
change
yeah.
so much, too.
Yeah.
So.
But also, what's interesting to me is, like, they know you're going where you're going, but it's at those two spots that they go nuts.
Yeah.
When, the whole drive, they know where you're headed.
Yeah, totally.
It's great. Thank you.
Sure.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Mesa. So as far as where I write pretty much anywhere. I travel a fair amount, but I can write on subways, I can write on planes, I can write at home, so I'm not very fussy about that. And what I'm currently interested in, my next novel, is writing about a company town. So place is very important. It's kind of the defining characteristic of the story in some ways. Is like, because it's an isolated sort of area, everyone who's in there works for the company in some way. They can't really leave it since that's their job. So it's kind of this pressure cooker. So anything that happens has these ripple effects across the entire town and all the people in it. And they sort of rebound off the, the boundaries of it in interesting ways. So that's what I'm interested in place.
Fantastic. Thank you. Did we miss anyone? People in the back?
My name is Angela. And the first question about where we write, I've tried many different things because I'm a freelancer. So I write, not fiction for fun and other things for work. And I think I find interesting that I can do my work anywhere. But when I write fiction, I do need certain kind of environment. Like, it can be home, but it just needs to be a little more sacred somehow. Like, I have to create certain things before, like maybe music or maybe other things. Like, it just needs to clear up a little bit. And it needs to be very organized. So there can be no mess. It has to be very, very organized. And when I started, I've been writing a novel for a while. And when I started to write, I wanted to do this thing that was, I wanted to have the story in English and Spanish. And I started to write in English. And the version in English was set in New York. And I wanted to have the same version, but set in Bogota, because that's where I'm from, Colombia. And I don't know, I'm just working in the English version first. But I always wonder, if it would make, as a writer, what it would make, if it would make a big difference, to set it up in a different place.
Yeah, I guess that's something you're going to discover, but it's a great question. What difference does it make? I feel like it's so specific to the story. It's so specific to what you're writing. In some cases, it would make such a difference that you wouldn't even be able to write the story. Remind me of your name? Nicole. I feel like what Nicole is writing about is so deeply bound up in culture and politics and so on that it's going to change everything to transplant it from one place to another. And then I feel like there are other stories that are, that the story could be told in a similar way, even if it was taking place in a different place. Bizarrely, I'm thinking of House of Cards, which I realize is not a piece of writing, but I'm a fan, and that was a series that was originally in Britain, and it was about British politics, and it's transplanted to our country. And I think that they've done sort of a stunning job of completely animating it from the inside out in a way that feels very specific to our nation's political landscape. It really depends. At this point, we're this has been so much fun. We're actually already running out of time, but I feel like for our last few minutes, we've addressed a lot of questions as we've gone along, but what are the urgent questions that you still have? I mean, there's this question of how much does the story change if you transplant the place? And again, I feel like it's very story specific, but what other questions are lingering?
I feel that if it's set in a tavern, it can be anywhere, right? I think it just depends on the story itself.
Right.
There are some stories that are not place dependent, and so if it's much more character dependent, those characters could be. But I'm more interested in not just that it's a different place, but that the culture itself is so different. And I think of South America. I think of again, I'm going back to the sensory thing of the smell, the feel, the humidity, the approach to life. That's the part that if that person, if your characters are, from Bogota and then they're from New York, then it's maybe not the same story at all. Now I'm back to the
What? No, finish your thought.
Remember that postcard, the epistolary novels that Griffin and That's almost bad. In which case, place didn't matter at all. It only mattered that they weren't in place.
Right.
But that was kind of primary process. That were because there was no place. They were kind of like in this very almost psychotic. I was working at the Dissociative Disorders Clinic at the time, and I gave it to my boss as a Christmas gift because it kind of like dissociative people. They weren't moved. It was all kind of primitive mental process.
But
picking up on your tavern and place. It can be New York, but if it's an Irish tavern or it's a tavern in Germantown, it's going to be totally different. I mean, it's still the same city. It's still New Yorkers.
Yeah.
But it's going to be a different language. It's going to be a different culture. It's going to be different drinks, food.
Do you think that the archetypes stay the same?
Sorry?
Do you think the archetypes stay the same? I mean, I was immediately jealous. Wow, you got all your archetypes right there.
In the tavern?
Yeah. In a small town, big city, whatever, you're going to get those same personalities.
But I love your point about how at different times of the day it was completely different. And that's, I think, really extra special about the public spaces. They're transformed by the people. And even just riding the bus. If you ride the bus in London, if you do it before 8 o'clock in the morning, you usually get night shift work. There is a people who go in to clean. And if you ride it in the afternoon, if you ride it late at night, 1 o'clock in the morning, people are coming back from class. And I love that point about the tavern, how the space transforms throughout the day. It becomes a completely different place. Many times throughout the day because of the different people that come there.
Absolutely. From the workers to the patrons. It opens at 10 in the morning. Very different than at midnight.
Yeah, and I think that that's an interesting thing that happens in writing when you centralize a place so thoroughly that it kind of becomes the fixed point, and you're able to use it to see all of these exquisitely nuanced changes, throughout the day or even throughout history. I mean, this book Visitation that I read from, the one about the house in Germany, it has a similar function because it sits there being a fixed point, but the change that it records as the result of being the fixed point, from 19th century Germany, through Weimar Republic Germany, through, the rise of the Third Reich to, the division of Germany. I mean, it's kind of an incredible book because it takes place and just puts it right at the center and just nails it down so that all of these other changes become so much more heightened. It's like, that very idea that you said of, if you sit on a bus all day long from the beginning of shift to the end, sort of what happens. There's actually a wonderful little piece in the New Yorker just a few weeks ago in which Ian Fraser, the writer, got on this bus in Brooklyn where there was recently a violent crime. And he rides the bus all day and just and talks to the different drivers coming on and off shift and also just sees the this sort of tidal change of New York. You know, the people coming off shift, and then the people going to work, and then small children, and then bigger kids coming home from school, and the way the whole city kind of pours itself through this one bus. Yeah. So I think that that's a really lovely thing about kind of turning your writing over and putting the place on top, which isn't always what you're going to do, but it's an interesting thing that can happen.
Making how places become vehicles for people. You know, so as well as the place affecting goods and people affected in the place.
Yeah.
I was, in listening to what everybody's saying, it's reminding me of the fact that I was an urban studies major in college, and I think that there was so many things that we did, like literally standing on a corner and coming back to it weekend, weekday, different times of day, and we were assigned these things. And so I think going back to the point that you made about, you know, being in your office as a psychology professor, I think that there are these things that you turn on and off in terms of observing, and I think that there were so many things, you know, even in understanding the socioeconomics or the sociology of a neighborhood and how it's changed over time and what were the reasons behind that, and those can be the underpinnings of understanding the motivations of characters and what's driving them, and, you know, particularly if there are characters in conflict in a place. So, you know, you think, you know, like gentrification is a perfect example of where people are placed in conflict in a place. But I think that it's making me realize that I should kind of go back and think about those things, not in terms of all the technical aspects, although there were some great texts that we read that kind of helped think about things, think about place,
right?
You know, as not accidental,
right? Right. You know, no, that's really interesting that there are aspects of your sort of pre-writing work that you could bring back into your writing. It's interesting. I always wonder sort of where place comes into the process of writing a given piece. Like if it comes in at the very beginning, if you start with a place, or if it's always different, right? Depending on whatever it is that you're working on. Do you start with a place, or do you start with, you know, like with my novel, do you start with a situation and then you're looking for a place? And I always wonder about Middlemarch, because I feel like Middlemarch is very in the air these days, because Rebecca Mead's wonderful book about it. It's been, a lot of people have written about Middlemarch, and which is also one of my favorite novels. And I've often wondered, I could probably find this out, if George Eliot started with the town, or if she started with the people, because one of the wonderful things about the way that novel operates is that it's such an intimate book about all of these people's lives, and yet it ends up being this fantastic sort of tapestry portrait of the life of this given town. Not quite as sort of extreme a town as the one you're talking about, not as homogeneous. But I always wondered, like, you know, did Eliot sit down and think, I'm going to create a town and then I'm going to zoom in and find the people, or did she find the people and then slowly build out the town, or a little bit of both, probably? We are. This has been so much fun. Does anybody want to have a last?
Just a quick question. What's the name of Ali Smith's book?
It is. I'm going to hold it up because it's so great.
I want to know how she gets rid of that guy.
It's called There But For The.
That's great.
And it's an excellent book. I highly recommend it. And thanks to all of you. This has been really fun, and I feel like we could have talked all day.
Thank you so much. This was so helpful.
Thank you.